The story begins with a man running. After a moment, it becomes clear that he was running away from the arrow. But no matter how much speed he had, arrow would always be faster. The arrow pierced his leg, and scarlet blood gushed out. As a result of his injuries, the man fell into the snow. It was our protagonist who directed his gaze at the one who fired the arrow. An elderly man dressed in a gray cape with a hood took out a sword and put it to the protagonist's throat. Controlling the situation, the man ordered his allies to search the protagonist. After checking all the pockets and places on the body where something could be hidden, they found the relic. In addition to the bag, a small pouch, and a hand wrapped in bandages, they managed to find a small relic that glittered under the bright moonlight. They found what they wanted. Now all they had to do was get rid of the protagonist. The man in the gray cape raised his sword and prepared to strike. A moment later, a huge amount of blood gushed out. The protagonist fought to the last, but in the end he was killed, just like in some computer game. Somewhere in the depths of the protagonist's consciousness, someone's voice was heard, telling him to kill. It was the voice of the mother of corruption, whom our protagonist asked not to be angry. Now the hand that we saw just recently slowly crawled towards our protagonist, and the protagonist himself told the mother of corruption that he needed to die one more time. Approaching the protagonist, the bandaged hand grabbed him with its sharp fingers. A mysterious silhouette, surrounded by green light and wearing a dark cape that hid its face, continued to tell our protagonist to kill. Apparently the mother of corruption was worried about the divinity inside the relic, which was recently taken away. Our protagonist assured her that there was no need to worry, because he had already completely absorbed all the divinity from the relic. Since the divinity of the relic had already been absorbed, it was necessary to get rid of the pursuers, so the protagonist allowed them to kill him, thereby getting rid of the tail. The fatal blow that severed his head turned out to be only a temporary inconvenience for our protagonist, and raising his head, he attached it back to his neck. Only along with the lost relic, our protagonist lost all the money he had. Well, let's get to know our protagonist better. When he was approaching 30, he was always tired and too busy with work to waste time on games, so he had to compromise with reality and use cheats. He couldn't even remember the name of the game or why he bought it, but he continued playing to play as a priest of corruption. But what kind of priest of corruption is this? It was the most difficult to learn, gameplay, and least effective gaming class. But what could our protagonist help himself? If only from one description of the priest of corruption, the heart began to beat faster. He eventually completed all of the class quests, getting closer to the endgame. But it was all just beginning, because an event occurred that divided his life into before and after. A mysterious green beam from the monitor pulled our protagonist into the portal, and then he became a priest of corruption once he entered the game. But the mother of corruption was still restless and continued to tell our protagonist to kill everyone. But the protagonist was calm. It seems he was used to her peculiar behavior. His acquaintance with the mother of corruption began 5 years ago. It was then that he began his path of service. Waking up in the game, he found himself in a gloomy room, illuminated only by the light of the moon. He had only 2 things with him: the robe of the Order of Corruption and the hand of the Mother of Corruption on his chest. Through this hand, our protagonist felt a connection with the huge embodiment of the goddess, and thanks to this, he was able to quickly accept the fact that he was in the game. According to the in-game description, the priest of corruption was a genetically modified human. Therefore, our protagonist has become stronger, and all his senses have become more acute. Even cutting off his head was not scary for him. From now on, his body could only be killed by divine power. But it seems that, along with the altered physical state, something happened to his consciousness. Previously, he could not stand the sight of blood. Just the sight of the red substance made him tremble. Now, even such disgusting and terrible scenes could not shake him. His consciousness had changed so much, but there was one problem. Our protagonist received various physical improvements, but at the same time lost the ability to sense tastes. The rest of the story continued in an urban area, and our protagonist entered a small building. His name was Marnak, and he came here for his ID. But besides this, he was interested in whether there were any other tasks that he could accept. The girl bent down slightly and began to sort through the pieces of paper, saying that there would certainly be a job for the priest of the guardian goddess. This news nevertheless made him happy. Once in the northern city, the protagonist decided to take on the guise of a member of the Order of the Guardians. If Marnak worshipped one god, but presented himself as a member of another order, then his deity would immediately go berserk and put a mark on him. The mark of punishment that the deity could impose was visible only to members of the order, but the mother of corruption was lenient toward such pretense. The order of corruption is the enemy of all living things and the enemy of everyone else, and our protagonist, hated by everyone, became the only follower of the mother of corruption. After reviewing the papers, the girl still bothered to find a suitable task for Marnak. Farnak took the sheet in his hands and, bringing it closer, began to peer at the written words. The essence of the task was to hunt bandits or monsters. They were ready to pay generously for a severed head or for any information. Most other mercenaries would have asked him to read the mission out loud, although for our protagonist, there was nothing unusual in the ability to read. Because once in this world, Marnak acquired the ability to read and write in the local language, which was not similar to either English or Korean. The essence of the task was clear to Marnak, but he wanted to know something from the girl. He asked if it was possible to receive part of the reward in advance. At first, the girl was skeptical about such a request, but still, he managed to persuade the girl to make concessions, and she agreed to pay him part of the reward in advance, warning him that he would have to pay a fine for the delay. The further story continued in a mountainous area covered with snow. When Marnak was talking to that girl, the mother of corruption decided that he had fallen in love with her. Marnak explained to the mother of corruption that it was a misunderstanding, and nothing like that happened. Suddenly, our protagonist was distracted by a guy walking behind him. A blue-eyed guy with white hair noticed that Marnak was not from these parts and asked him to tell him about his home. The guy also said that he should show up to his village soon. He hoped that everything was fine with his mother and father. The protagonist just silently looked at him, listening to every word, and it seems this guy's name was Pierre. It seems that Pierre turned out to be one of the talkative types and continued to talk with our protagonist. Thanks to the captain's generous gift, his parents shouldn't have any problems this winter, but he was still worried because of the latest news, in which there were rumors that the farmers were not being attacked by bandits or monsters, but by ghosts. A man walking ahead with a scar on his face called Pierre over. Pierre liked chatting with our protagonist. He said that he would go away for a while and would return. Meanwhile, the mother of corruption was still restless and ordered Marnak to destroy all his companions. But Marnak was skeptical of his goddess's wishes, since such an act could create even more problems. Marnak partly understood her desire to deal with these people. After all, she is the mother of corruption, but he would prefer to spend this winter in the warmth, and for this, he needed 29 pieces of silver. The mother of corruption again ordered her servant to destroy everyone who was nearby, but not as violently as before. Marnak realized that apparently he was too assertive. He asked the mother of corruption not to be upset by his words. And again, the mother of corruption wished for the death of everyone nearby. Marnak asked his goddess, how many fingers would she value his companions at? Looking at everyone who was nearby, the protagonist realized that everyone was quite ordinary people. Turns out that Marnak wasn't just asking how many fingers she would rate them at. If the protagonist destroyed them all and presented them to the mother of corruption, she would get the amount of divinity corresponding to the number of fingers they were rated at. If he collects 10,000 divinity, he will be able to gain a new ability. Thanks to the system, he was able to absorb the divinity of the holy relic and give only a useless cup to his pursuers. But besides this relic, there were 12 more similar ones, the divinity of which our protagonist had to absorb. Mother of Corruption said that if he managed to collect the divinity of all the relics, then any wish would come true. First of all, our protagonist wanted his sense of taste to return to him. Marnak was distracted from his thoughts by the voice of Pierre, who had returned. The captain asked him to talk less, because not everyone could have the patience to listen to Pierre from morning to night. But Marnak did not care at all what this captain said. He asked Pierre not to worry about his talkativeness. Every person is special in his own way, and Pierre was no exception. Suddenly something caught our Marnak's attention. Several arrows hit the crew members and the cart driver. Pierre was not prepared for such a sudden turn of events and fell into a stupor from what he saw. To protect the unprepared Pierre, our protagonist grabbed him by the clothes and threw him back. And he did it just in time, because a wave of arrows was rapidly approaching him. Alas, he did not have time to dodge these arrows, since first of all he was saving Pierre's life. Pierre could barely hold back tears from what he saw. He was very worried about our protagonist. The attackers turned out to be people in white capes, waiting for the right moment to attack. From his injuries, our protagonist fell into the snow. Such a rude and sudden attack resembled local bandits. Although Marnak suffered, he remained alive, and the Mother of Corruption suggested that he pretend to be dead and take away the divinity of the bandits when they approached. The option that the Mother of Corruption suggested was quite simple to implement. But although Marnak tried to obey his goddess, in some moments his opinion was higher than the orders of the goddess. By a fortunate coincidence, there was a sword nearby. Shining brightly in the daylight, Marnak ran to the sword and grabbed it. Usually, in cases of attack by bandits, our protagonist did not hide, but was ready to engage in open battle. First of all, Marnak did what he wanted. The archer sitting in the bushes was already preparing to release an arrow, but he turned out to be slow, and this became his fatal mistake. The remaining team was nearby, and each of them saw how the protagonist dealt with the archer. The man with white hair did not like this turn of events. The man took Marnak on his own and ordered the others to strip the remaining men near the wagon. Our protagonist sensed rapidly approaching danger. The leader of the bandits attacked Marnak with all speed. Their swords clashed, and a life-and-death battle began. The protagonist repelled the attack of the bandit leader with a powerful counterattack. He jumped away from Marnak, his boots sliding on the thick layer of snow. Marnak turns to the Mother of Corruption and asks how many fingers she will value the opponent with whom he is currently fighting. And the man didn't seem to like that Marnak was chatting with someone there. His eyes were full of madness, and his face was covered with a devilish and evil smile. And again, their swords clashed and the battle continued. Marnak and the leader of the bandits fought a fierce struggle. Every second a metallic ringing could be heard from the blows of their swords. Finally, the Mother of Corruption gave an answer to the protagonist's question. She rated the enemy at 2.5 fingers. Marnak was surprised that the ordinary bandit was on the same level as the ranger who beheaded him. It seems this game, like many others, did not have perfect balance. Marnak jumps to a safe distance and takes a defensive stance, and the bandit rushes at him at full speed, giggling evilly, preparing to deal a crushing blow. And so, having overtaken our protagonist, the bandit struck. Marnak managed to repel the attack with the value of his own sword. A few seconds later, half of the severed sword, flying in the air, fell and stuck its tip into the snow. It seemed to the bandit that he had gained an invincible advantage. Marnak lost his weapon, but his sword remained intact. A feeling of euphoric superiority washed over him, and he burst into deafening, evil laughter. That's why the protagonist preferred frost steel for equipment. It only took a few powerful blows for his sword to split into two. The bandit thought that Marnak was a simple person like many, and there was nothing remarkable or special about him. If so, the bandit was ready to let the protagonist escape alive. All the same, this should have been their last task before they left the city with the loot. So why not end things peacefully so as not to waste each other's time? Marnak just silently threw his sword into the snow. A second later, a sinister grin appeared on his face. In response to the offer to disperse peacefully, Marnak made a counteroffer to the bandit, demanding that he stop robbing people and leave immediately. If they do this, then Marnak promised not to pursue them and to keep the word of a true gentleman. The bandits were in confusion. He had just invited the protagonist to disperse peacefully, and now this Marnak will also be able to put forward some conditions for him. Does he really think that they will just agree and leave here? Marnak wanted to continue the conversation with the bandit, but his speech was interrupted by an arrow that suddenly hit him in the head. The bandit breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, his partners had arrived to the rescue, otherwise he was beginning to think that Marnak would again enter into a fierce battle. But it seems his team had been watching the fight for some time, as they had seen the bandit chop the protagonist's sword in two with a single blow. The bandit asked if they were finished with the others. Yes, they cut the throats of everyone who crossed their path. They were overcome by a feeling of superiority and the joy of victory. Well, this feeling was only a fleeting moment, until the moment the voice of the protagonist made each of them flinch in place. Less than a minute ago, an arrow hit his head, and now Marnak, as if nothing had happened, slowly rose up. The bandit, who fought with the protagonist and who had previously felt the taste of sweet victory, experienced a huge sense of fear that shackled his body. Marnak sarcastically asked the bandits why they were surprised. Have they never seen a person survive a fatal arrow to the head? The arrow hit was only a temporary inconvenience for Marnak. Conventional weapons were not capable of causing him any harm, but the bandits did not seem to know who Marnak really was, and therefore, this event was shocking and unexpected for them. Marnak gave them a chance to disperse peacefully, without shedding blood, and they repaid him with an arrow to the head. The bandit had only one thing to do: pray to be saved from the beast that they awakened in the depths of Marnak's soul. In a fit of panic, the leader of the bandits ordered his allies to open fire on the protagonist, completely forgetting that even a hit to the head did not kill him. Several arrows hit the target, but Marnak did not budge. He stood like a majestic and unshakable rock. He called out to the mother of corruption, asking her to make the right decision, since he was too scared and confused. The bandits were terrified of Marnak. They shot a huge number of arrows at him, and he stood there without moving, even with bleeding wounds. At that moment, the bandits realized that Marnak was too strong, and desperately rushed away as fast as they could. But having stumbled upon an invisible barrier, they realized that their attempt to escape was futile. This barrier represented a line that the living could not cross. The Reaper of Corruption was required to use this ability before releasing his true powers. Marnak thanked the Mother of Corruption for endowing him with such powerful powers. In a fit of despair, the leader of the bandits ordered to take out swords, hoping that with their help, they would be able to break through the barrier. When life is moments away from death, a person is ready to do anything to somehow try to save his life. But the leader of the bandits failed to do this. His life was interrupted by one powerful blow. The team looked in horror at what had become of their captain. He was their last hope, their last moral support, and now he was gone. The one who took out the bandit leader was a huge monster that came out of nowhere. The monster's huge white muscular arm, covered with veins, left only scraps of blood at the site of the impact. It was a creature that you wouldn't see even in your worst nightmares. A huge white monster, with 4 arms and huge teeth that will mercilessly tear the victim into pieces. Silent horror froze on the faces of the bandits, fear shackled their bodies, and hope for salvation slowly faded away. The roar of the monster could be heard for many kilometers. In desperation, the bandits tried to break through the barrier with their bare hands, while the monster gradually approached them. Tears were streaming down their faces. Everything did not go according to plan. They begged to be spared, promising never to take the criminal path and start life from scratch. From these words, Marnak only grinned evilly. The screams of the helpless bandits began to amuse him. The Mother of Corruption told him to leave the heads intact, and the rest was not important. Alas, pleas for help did not help, and all that was left were huge pieces of blood scattered everywhere. Some time passed, the bandits were finished, and Marnak moved back at a leisurely pace. He returned to the site where the attack had originally taken place. The cart was overturned, lifeless, and bloody bodies lay everywhere. Marnak clarified to the Mother of Corruption. Did she really want him to gather divinity from these bodies? It was risky to do this, because in this case, their bodies would disappear, and the guild squad that would be sent to investigate would definitely suspect something was wrong. There was deathly silence all around. Only small gusts of wind sometimes disturbed it. But suddenly Marnak was attracted by a sound that clearly stood out from the general atmosphere. It was Pierre, who was still miraculously alive, even with an arrow in his chest. Marnak told the Mother of Corruption that he would give her a gift as soon as he could. But now, he must save the guy, since it would have a beneficial effect on his reputation. Pierre was still alive, but he was bleeding, and Marnak, even with his abilities, could not cure it. So he asked the Mother of Corruption to stop the bleeding, otherwise Pierre might not last long. After this, the narration of the story takes us to the girl who was holding the very relic from the beginning of the story. She asked, "What happened to the thief who dared to steal the relic?" A man with brown eyes reported to her that the thief was beheaded on the spot. In response to this, the girl asked, "Where is the body of this thief?" The man explained that the trackers had limited resources and could not afford to slow down while dragging the corpse all the way. The priestess answered him only with a deep silence, like the bottom of the sea. Having placed the relic, the priestess told the man that he could be free, at least for the near future. The priestess said that she intended to go on a pilgrimage. The man was surprised by this. Why did she suddenly decide to visit there? Did she really make such a sudden decision because of a prophecy? Yes, it was the prophecy that forced her to make such an unexpected decision. Besides, she has to meet someone. After this narrative, the stories return to our protagonist. Pierre's bleeding was stopped, but he lost too much blood and was unable to walk on his own. So Marnak carried him in his arms, which was not a difficult task for him. 10 years ago, a prophecy was revealed to all religious orders. The end of all things will take the form of life and fall upon the world. This was the prophecy mentioned earlier. Marnak completed his task, delivering Pierre safe and sound. The guards carrying Pierre away were surprised at how a medium-sized young man was able to drag the huge Pierre alone. The girl who came running to the protagonist said that she had received permission from the guards, and there was no need to worry about anything. The girl looked at Marnak with admiration. By the look of it, and it was hard to imagine that a young man of average size possessed such tremendous strength. Marnak agreed with her and did not deny the fact. But this was not the main thing she wanted to talk about with our protagonist. Her attention was drawn to the bloody bag in her left hand, filled with heads. She learned that these people were the source of all the recent problems. The girl invited him to transfer this bag for safekeeping to the guild, to which Marnak immediately agreed. Walking through the city at night, which was illuminated by street lamps, the girl asked if Marnak had a place to sleep. Marnak said that now is the right time to go in search of the right room to spend the night there. This means that Marnak did not have a place where he could spend the night. Turning to him, she asked in a gentle and affectionate voice if he would mind spending the night with her. Marnak felt a slight feeling of awkwardness. His face turned red, his pupils dilated. Marnak accepted the girl's proposal. As always, the mother of corruption was unhappy, but Marnak explained that he understood everything and had no evil plans for the red-haired young lady. When the girl said that she would allow her to spend the night, she meant that she would allow her to spend the night in the guest room of the mercenary guild. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps was heard outside the door, attracting the attention of our protagonist. The face of a red-haired girl appeared in the doorway. She would be glad to give our protagonist a longer rest, but there is one matter that requires his presence. Slowly getting out of bed and putting on soft slippers, Marnak says that he will do this without any problems. However, what kind of task is this that requires his presence? It turned out that the matter was serious. The mayor himself wanted to meet with the protagonist. Marnak was surprised that such an important person wanted to see him, but what did he need? The girl named the reason. The deceased captain of a group of mercenaries, named Gilad, was the mayor's half-brother. It was this man who became the reason why the mayor wanted to meet with the protagonist. The narrative of our story continues in a large mansion. As soon as Marnak approached the house, he was met by the butler and led inside. The butler completed his task, and the mayor told him that he could be free. The mayor's name was Traden Filion. It was a man about 50 years old, his face adorned with a beard and thick black hair. Traden wanted to meet because he knew that Marnak had been with his brother in the last moments of his life. He offered Marnak a cup of aromatic tea, but Marnak only smiled a devilish smile. When the mother of corruption saw the mayor, she drew a cross on him. "I wonder what it would be like to live pretending to be human," ran through the protagonist's mind. But the whole point is that the mayor was not at all who he said he was. There could only be one reason for the mother to draw a cross on the mayor. He was an inanimate creature, and among them, there is only one that can take the form of a person. Demon. That's who could hide his true essence, pretending to be an ordinary person at first glance. Although dust demons are the strongest creatures in this world, they are capable of little on their own. And to become part of this world, demons have no choice but to make deals with its inhabitants. This is why demons love all living things. But the gods hated them, those who gave the inhabitants of the earthly world what the gods had once taken from them. And, in the end, the gods made a statement to their followers and to all the inhabitants of the world. From that moment on, they called the demons real evil. Since then, the priests began hunting demons. Blood and death were everywhere. In some places, the atmosphere of real hell reigned, strewn with corpses and drenched in blood. Marnak remembered that the demon disciple class was quite difficult, and people tried to avoid it. He remembered this because it was the second class for which he played. Traden looked like an ordinary person, and many would not be able to understand who he really was. But our protagonist saw right through him. Traden was surprised that Marnak was able to unravel his secret. Who could have imagined that through the death of Gilead, such an important guest would honor him with his presence? And since Marnak understood who Traden really was, then our protagonist has nothing to do with the guardian goddess. Traden stopped hiding his true nature and said that Marnak could call him creeping expectation. There was no longer any need to hide, and Marnak introduced himself to the mayor as a follower of the mother of corruption. Traden was surprised that a follower of the order of corruption visited him, since he believed that the order had long been destroyed. He asked the protagonist to sit down and continue the conversation in a more comfortable atmosphere. Anyway, they were alone here. They looked at each other for a while, but then the mayor broke the silence. To be honest, he didn't call him for any specific reason. He wondered exactly how Gilad died. Traden said that the protagonist's contribution would not go unnoticed, and he would be grateful for the information. Since Traden wanted to know the truth, that Marnak gladly told all the details. It all happened by an unfortunate coincidence. In the cold of winter, after Gilad had complained about the lack of orders, the mayor had found him a job that looked a little dubious, but who helped to think that this would cause his imminent death. Life is a very interesting thing. And not only interesting, but also complex. Trayden did not remain in debt, and generously thanked Marnak with gold coins. It was not a bribe, but a sincere thanks for the truth about his brother's death. Marnak was not one of those who could be bribed, and the mother of corruption, with her wayward behavior and character, went too far. She didn't seem to like how the meeting between Marnak and the demon went. The protagonist asked her to calm down, because it is very important to always listen to the interlocutor to the end. It seems that these words made the mother of corruption calm down. Her hand stopped twitching nervously. There was something else that, like gold, was just as eternal and would never deteriorate. This is Marnak's love for the mother of corruption. That's what he meant. These words seemed to melt the dead heart of the mother of corruption. The hand did not twitch, and her voice no longer sounded so aggressive. Finally, she did what Marnak asked of her. Calm down and listen to him. For him, she was the most important, and nothing could replace her, so she shouldn't worry so much. Having had a heartfelt conversation with the mother of corruption, Marnak hid her hand and went about his business while the wind behind blew the fallen leaves. After some time, our protagonist returned to the red-haired lady, which she was happy about. She asked if Marnak would like to greet the priests of the Order of Enlightenment. These people were unpleasant to Marnak. He did not have the slightest desire to communicate with these idiots. However, in the next second, something made him surprised so much that his pupils dilated several times. Some mysterious and ominous aura seemed to emanate from these people. Seeing them, the mother of corruption immediately understood everything and told the reason for her concern to our protagonist. One of them had a sacred relic, but because of the cloaks and armor, it was impossible to see who was the owner of the relic. One of the members of the Order of Enlightenment entered into a dialogue with our protagonist. He was extremely surprised, because he did not expect to meet a priest of the guardian goddess here. This man's name was Orvis, and it looks like this man was very experienced. His face was adorned with scars, and his piercing gaze did not express a single drop of emotion. The big guy's name was Cornu, and the pretty-looking girl with brown hair was called Patina. It was our Marnak's turn to introduce himself to these people. As always, he introduced himself to them as a servant of the guardian goddess. It seems that the priests of the Enlightenment also decided to stop here, like Marnak. What a relief, Marnak said. Although there was nothing close to relief, even if not now, he would still have enough opportunities to steal their relic. The only problem is that when he absorbs the divinity of the relic, the divinity of corruption inevitably enters the world. This was beginning to look not like a priest, but like a real thief of corruption. The voice of Orvis pulled the protagonist out of his thoughts. He said that they were going away for a short time to visit the mayor. He was glad to meet our protagonist and said they would get to know each other better the next time they met. Marnak wondered why they decided to visit the mayor. And again, the voice of the red-haired girl distracted our protagonist from his thoughts. They usually provide shelter to priests, like those three, for a reasonable fee, and this meant that Marnak had to pay for last night's stay, although initially he thought that he would not have to pay. The girl allowed him to spend the night here, not because she was not indifferent to him, but because he was a priest. Marnak, of course, expected something like this, but was still a little disappointed. However, the girl had her own reasons for inviting Marnak here. There was one request that she wanted the protagonist to fulfill. She approached the protagonist and whispered in his ear in a gentle voice, "Can he cast a spell over the food so that it does not spoil and is preserved?" Such unusual behavior seemed strange to the protagonist. Why did she need to come so close and whisper in his ear? The way Marnak responded to this request made her smile, although the next second the smile disappeared from his face. Suddenly Marnak was distracted by someone's voice. It was one of the members of the Order of Enlightenment, but why didn't he go with the others? This is the question that arose in the mind of our protagonist. Cornu was the only one of the trio who did not go to visit the mayor, and there was a special reason for this. Because of his race, many northern mayors were prejudiced against him. He only expressed his respect and saw off his comrades. The girl, however, believed that Mr. Trayden was not one of those people who hate because of race. He may be cold to others, but he is extremely professional. He clearly separated work and personal life. The townspeople really liked his professionalism, and they actively supported him. Therefore, the girl did not advise the priests to slander the mayor. Cornu said that he would remember her words. However, he asked to tell something else about Mr. Trayden. A heartfelt conversation ensued between these three. They talked for some time on various topics, but Marnak still had one question that tormented him. Why did the Order of Enlightenment decide to pay a visit to the mayor? They did it for a reason. They followed a prophecy received 10 years ago. Orvis thinks that the end of all things, which will take the form of life, implies a demon. Is the Order of Enlightenment here because it considers the mayor to be a demon? No, they don't think so, but Orvis just wants to see for himself. And he does this because he has the ability to check whether a person is a demon or not, thanks to his sacred relic. If a demon was nearby, the sacred relic in the form of a blue crystal began to emit a bright blue light, warning of danger. And Orvis and Patina just found one of the demons. Once the cover was blown, Tredin no longer needed to hide his true identity. A powerful explosion was heard nearby, attracting the attention of many. A huge monster was crawling around the city. Its eyes were filled with rage, and its mouth was lined with sharp teeth. His steps were so loud that they could be heard many hundreds of meters away. But people could not allow the monster to walk the streets of the city with impunity. The first to engage in battle with the terrifying monster was Orvis. With his hammer, he struck the monster's head with incredible force. There was a deafening explosion, so powerful that the previous one seemed like a clap in the background. Orvis's hammer possessed truly limitless power. Few could cope with such power. Cornu and Marnak ran out into the street, and pointing in the direction where the explosion occurred, Cornu said that they needed to run to help. Marnak told him to go first, and he would do some other things first, and be back soon. First, our protagonist visited Erin, the same red-haired girl who he had met more than once. She was confused and did not understand what was happening. Marnak asks where he is. Erin stands there in deep confusion, not knowing what to say. Picking up Erin, Marnak tries to find out where the infirmary is where Pierre was placed, but staying in one place for a long time in the current situation was dangerous. With one powerful jump, the protagonist flew up to a height of several floors. Concentrating all his strength in his legs, Marnak landed and broke the stone floor, and without stopping for a second, he continued to run forward. Erin was shaking with fear. Her heart was beating several times faster, which was not surprising considering what she saw. A huge toothy monster towered over the city houses. People fled in fear from a terrible monster whose strength was monstrous. Erin could not hold back her tears from what she saw. Never in her life had she seen such wild horror on people's faces. The monster was rampaging in the very center of the city, destroying everything that stood in its way. Nothing could resist its powerful force. But now the huge monster was not the main thing. It was necessary to find out where Pierre was. Pointing her finger in one direction, Erin said in a trembling voice that Pierre was there. Half the problem was already solved. All that remained was to find him. Having burst into the building, the protagonist looked around and saw Pierre lying in a hospital bed. Fortunately, he was alive and without injuries. It was a great luck that Pierre was not injured, considering that real hell was going on very nearby. Farnak could not allow him to die in this chaos, after having worked so hard to save the man's life. Although Pierre was safe and sound, he had not yet come to his senses. The protagonist carefully lifted him from the hospital bed and put him on his shoulder. Erin couldn't be carried with one hand, so Marnak said to grab onto it and hold on tight. Erin didn't mind and grabbed the protagonist with her gentle hands with great joy. Gaining strength to jerk, Marnak broke the stone floor beneath him with just one foot. And so, the protagonist made a dash. His speed was like an arrow fired from a bow. Erin seemed to be getting used to what was happening, and in addition to that, she remembered one important thing. There was a secret passage to safety nearby. Since she knew where the secret passage was, let her tell her where it is. Erin pointed to the door of an unremarkable building, saying that in that direction was what they were looking for. In this house, there was a secret passage leading to the outskirts of the city, but unfortunately the door was closed. Although to hell with the closed door, this was not a problem for our protagonist. Flying in at full speed, Marnak knocked down the wooden door with a crash. Each time Erin was amazed at the capabilities of her savior. She had been partial to him before, but now her passion was awakened even more. Marnak braked, his boots sliding on the stone floor. A new wave of surprise washed over Erin. She still found it hard to believe that someone could have such abilities. She was once again convinced of Marnak's enormous strength. They were now in a safe place, but Marnak warned them to run away immediately if the situation worsened. What about Marnak? Isn't he going to stay here? Farnak headed towards the exit, saying that he needed to return to the battlefield. Erin wanted to stop our protagonist because she was afraid for his life. But who could stop Marnak? That's right, no one. Even the mother of corruption often had no power over him. After running through the city streets, Marnak returned to the areas affected by the huge demon. What he saw made him freeze in place, his heart sank, and his knees began to tremble. Wounded and bloodied, Cornu lay on the ground, unable to move. Marnak immediately ran up to him. Fleeting and missing one eye, Cornu still recognized our protagonist. Although with difficulty, he could speak. Unfortunately, however, his wounds were too deep. Marnak could not do anything about what happened. Even the strongest could not hold out for long with such injuries. But what happened to the rest of the priests from the Trinity? Where are they now? Cornu was bleeding so much that they could barely speak. But after overcoming the hellish pain, he managed to speak again. Cornu was still alive, but Patina was dead. Crushed by huge stones, crippled by a giant monster. Is there really no way to defeat such a bloodthirsty and merciless demon? Will he continue to rampage through the streets of the city, taking the lives of innocent people? But there was still a way to defeat this ruthless monster. The blue crystal was not the only relic. Along with this, they brought a second relic, the divine sword, which Orvis managed to stick into the demon's head. But even this was not enough to kill the merciless demon. To kill such a powerful monster, the sword must be pierced into the brain, and then the monster must die. Those were Cornu's last words. In his last moments before his death, he managed to tell the way to defeat the demon. From now on, Cornu rested in eternal sleep, heading to his forefathers in heaven. Marnak presented the fallen warrior's divinity to his goddess, the mother of corruption, receiving 100 divinity. Orvis was the only survivor of the Trinity priests. Despite the wounds, despite the pain, despite the bitterness of losing his allies, he continued to fight the monster in order not only to protect the townspeople, but also to avenge his fallen allies. From the blows of the hammer, the demon screamed so that his roar could be heard far beyond the city limits. The divine relic was still stuck in the demon's head. There was very little left to put an end to this bloody madness. Marnak hurried to the demon as fast as he could. This was his chance. The protagonist rose into the air, preparing to strike. The sword pierced the demon's body, releasing scarlet blood. Orvis was only moments away from swinging his hammer at the sword and driving it into the demon's brain. And Marnak, who landed on the monster's body, watched this action. However, in the next moment, his gaze expressed only one misunderstanding. It seemed that something had gone wrong. A second ago, he saw Orvis, who was just one step away from ending the bloody nightmare, but now there was no one there. Marnak turned his head in the other direction, and what he saw made him fall into a stupor. He hoped that his eyes were deceiving him, and that what he saw was not true. But unfortunately, the truth turned out to be sad. The demon swiped at Orvis and crushed him to a pulp with one mighty blow. Opening its mouth, the huge creature let out a heartbreaking roar that made the heart stop. Marnak decides to use the death roll technique, but his plan fails. The monster is too strong. Marnak lands on the ground, breaking the stone road beneath him. A motionless body lay among a pile of rubble, and beneath it, a pool of blood was slowly spreading. But even such a strong blow cannot easily kill a servant of the Mother of Corruption. The Mother of Corruption often told him that blessings are always followed by curses. It would seem that real hell was going on around him. People were dying, but something made him smile. After a moment, it becomes clear that the reason for his smile was the same divine relic that he originally wanted to steal. Who would have thought that just like this, in an atmosphere of real madness, he would be able to get the desired sacred relic? Marnak slowly brought the sacred relic to his chest. He donated a sacred relic to the Mother of Corruption, asking in return to give it new power. The Mother of Corruption began the process of destroying the seal of the sacred relic. A few moments later, the sacred relic was destroyed, and the protagonist was rewarded with an impressive amount of divinity. It seemed that each sacred relic contained enough divinity to grant one ability. Another seal was broken, which brought a smile to Marnak's face. But what has changed? A huge amount of divinity was obtained, although no changes were observed. However, breaking the relic seal and gaining the ability introduced one peculiarity. Now the hand of the Mother of Corruption could be at a greater distance from the protagonist. But isn't this too weak an effect after absorbing the sacred relic? The Mother of Corruption did not like such harsh statements, and she dug her nails into the stone ruins. Marnak apologized, saying that he was simply enjoying her new opportunities. But now they were in a difficult situation, and this was not the time for jokes. Marnak closed his eyes, concentrating all his spiritual energy to communicate with his mother. He presented his mother with 10,000 divinities, asking her to give him new power. A bright sphere appeared nearby, emitting light and shooting rays in different directions. The protagonist was pleased with what his mother gave him in exchange for his offering to her. The letters of corruption became our protagonist's reward in exchange for the 10,000 divinity that he donated to his mother. The effect of this ability was incredibly simple, yet powerful. Activating the letters of corruption, Marnak covered his body with dark green metaphysical tattoos. The tattoos that appeared greatly enhanced the physical abilities of the already unflappable Marnak. The protagonist thanked the mother of corruption for being endowed with such a powerful ability, and now was just the right time to try it out. The demon's blow was strong, but thanks to genetic enhancements, his leg grew together quickly enough. Shifting his gaze to the other side, Marnak saw what attracted his attention. What he saw made him change his facial expression. Among the chest of rubble lay the bloody Orvis. He did not breathe, did not move. The sparkle of life disappeared in his eyes. Unfortunately, he did not manage to survive after being hit by the demon. For a moment, memories of how the demon pushed him down flashed through the protagonist's head, and it seems that they fell from the back of the demons almost simultaneously. Marnak fortunately survived, but Orvis, even being a strong priest, was unable to survive such a blow. Marnak was powerless in the current situation. In some cases, he could help wounded but still living people, but he was powerless to help the dead. All Marnak could do was wish for Orvis to rest in peace, but even being dead, he could somehow help our protagonist. With folded hands, Marnak humbly asked the mother of corruption to accept the divinity of this brave warrior. Meanwhile, the demon continued to rage in the city. His heartbreaking roar could be heard from everywhere. The sound made the heart turn icy. The demon destroyed everything in its path. Not a single building, nothing could withstand its onslaught. But there was one oddity that haunted our protagonist. The priests of the Order of Enlightenment, who angered the demon, were dead. But despite their deaths, the demon was still rampaging for some reason. Marnak had a different opinion about demons. He thought that they were not animals, driven only by instincts. For some time, our protagonist was confused and did not understand what to do in the current situation. But suddenly an idea flashed through his head. Marnak turned to the mother of corruption that was hiding behind his bosom. He told her to hold on tight. With Marnak covered in dark green tattoos, it was time to test his newly acquired ability. Having run up with unprecedented speed, he headed towards the monster that was rampaging through the city. His single step left a giant spiderweb crack in the stone road. In the bright red eyes of the demon, one could see the reflection of our rapidly approaching protagonist. Having made several powerful jumps, Marnak got close to the huge demon. But the demon could not allow anyone to get so close, and with his tail swinging, he was preparing to deliver a fatal blow. Just one blow from the tail caused an explosion of enormous power, but Marnak managed to dodge at the last second. Finally, here it is, a chance to defeat the demon. A white sacred sword, sparkling in the daylight and drenched in the blood of a demonic creature. It was impossible to hesitate for a second. Every mistake could end in a sad outcome. Suddenly, the demon began to bend over. It looked like this huge creature was about to use the roll technique again. However, even such a seemingly deadly attack was not scary for our protagonist. After all, this is exactly what he was waiting for. All that remained was to act according to the plan. The demon began to roll, trying to kill Marnak with sharp thorns. But even being in mortal danger, Marnak did not lose his smile for a second. From what was happening, the adrenaline in his blood boiled to unprecedented heights. The same technique used by the monster will not work on the protagonist a second time. The monster rolled through the city. An explosion of unprecedented power was heard. Everything that was near the demon was instantly destroyed. Numerous pieces of debris flew at a monstrous speed, scattering throughout the city. Windows in houses were destroyed by the shockwave. The fragments fell like glass rain. On top of this, our protagonist finds himself in an even more difficult situation. Looking at his hand, covered in his own blood, Marnak realized that the letters of corruption were draining him faster than previously expected. But the huge and merciless demon did not care about this. All he wanted was chaos and destruction. The letters of corruption endowed our protagonist with unprecedented powers, but at the same time forced his body to rot from the inside. This effect was gradual, and if the battle with the demon dragged on, the corruption would spread throughout the body and Marnak would die. It was impossible to waste a second, because at any moment, this second could become the last. Marnak jumped on the demon's head and grabbed the sacred sword, the last hope for destroying the merciless monster. Bleeding and experiencing hellish pain, Cornu in the last moments of his life told the protagonist how to destroy the demon, hoping that he would complete the work they started. All that remained was to put pressure on the sword and plunge it into the brain in order to put an end to the ruthless demon forever. But unexpectedly, a mysterious smile appeared on Marnak's face. It was not the joy of taking revenge on the demon for the fallen priests. In this smile, one could read what kind of treachery, some kind of cunning. And in the next second, it becomes clear to us why our protagonist smiled so sarcastically. Because, instead of plunging the sword into the demon, he took it out. Marnak looked at the wound left by the sacred relic, and how strange energy flows emanated from there. Somewhere there, deep inside the demon, Triton's human form was visible. The demon began to slowly disintegrate, particles of his body breaking into small pieces, just like the buildings he was destroying. A bright blue flash erupted in the city center and continued to spread throughout all the streets. People couldn't believe what they saw. It was hard to believe that the merciless demon had finally been defeated. And Erin was still with Pierre, looking after him and not leaving his side, but something distracted her attention. Erin stared at the bright flash that lit up the entire city. Now our story has returned to the scene of the battle with the demon. Threaten's body lay among the pile of rubble, and a pool of blood spread beneath it. The protagonist approached and asked if he had woken up. Threaten was fine. Meeting Marnak was the greatest blessing he could ask for. But Marnak said that there was no need to praise him so much. And what about the sword? It seemed that it greatly suppressed the will and clouded the mind. But was the gold spent worth it? More than how much gold Triton paid Marnak could not be compared with how Marnak not only did not kill him, but also helped him get out of his insane state. Then the narration of the story is transferred to the girl that we met quite recently. Smoothly waving her hand, the girl threw a bright ball shrouded in blue flame to the ground. Just one moment, and the nearby snow immediately evaporated. In addition to the girl, a mysterious figure shrouded in white cloth was watching this. This was the man we met at the very beginning of the story. He looked with inspired eyes at what the fireball was doing. Each time he contemplated this amazing ability, the man realized how incredible it was. The blue flame enveloped everything in its path, destroying snow while preserving living vegetation. And the girl used this ability for a reason. The bearded man brought her here to show her the body of the protagonist, but he was not here. Quite a long time had passed since their last meeting. The man decided that monsters or wild animals had stolen the remains of Marnak. Well, perhaps it was, even though there wasn't a single drop of blood nearby. In any case, the girl was grateful to the bearded man for taking her here. However, besides this, she wanted to ask the man something else. She was interested in information about each of the nearby cities, and the ranger could certainly tell her about several of them. Now the narrative of our story has shifted back to the city ruins. The mayor's butler and the protagonist walked slowly along the street filled with the rubble of buildings. Having reached their destination, the butler went to the door and opened it in front of Marnak, inviting him inside. Marnak walked with a bright and radiant smile on his face. It seemed that what had happened recently had no effect on his mood. Dryden, who had been waiting impatiently for Marnak, greeted him with the same radiant smile all over his face. With each new meeting, Marnak looked better and better to him. Marnak was grateful to the mayor for such a compliment. Words cannot express how grateful the mayor was to our protagonist, the demon slayer, for saving him. But only the demon was alive and well. What an irony of fate, isn't it? Being a demon, he fully understood that they also wanted to live. It would be strange to imagine that there are creatures in the world born only to die. Tradon's words made some sense, because any creature, regardless of its nature, will fight for its life at all costs. But how did it happen that the protagonist began to be called a demon slayer? After the commotion had subsided, Tredon announced that the credit for killing the demon and saving the mayor belonged to Marnak. The townspeople rejoiced when they heard what a feat Marnak had accomplished and called him a demon slayer. Erin liked this nickname because at every meeting she addressed the protagonist as the demon slayer, attracting everyone's attention. So, in just one day, the unknown priest Marnak became the object of everyone's talk. Such fame caused inconvenience, because when entering the mercenary guild, he could not pass unnoticed, attracting the gaze of dozens of people. At every opportunity, he tried to avoid unnecessary attention from his fans. The conversation continued. Tredon took out a metal teapot and several glasses, but while he was doing this, Marnak noticed how his wooden prosthetics moved as smoothly as if they were real limbs. This seemed very strange to him, but Tredon behaved this way only in the presence of our protagonist. When going out in public, he limped conspicuously, and in order to move his prosthetics so naturally, he had to pay a high price. Marnak clearly became nervous after the mayor's words and asked what price was discussed. Trayden just brought the cup with the aromas of tea, and after taking a small sip, he enjoyed the delicate taste of the drink, smiling like a devil. It seems the high price was that his hair would eventually lose its strength and fall off like autumn leaves. If they had met a few months later, Marnak would certainly have noticed the shining bald spot on Trayden's head. From the image of the bald Trayden that arose in his head, Marnak shed a tear, imagining how terrible it would look. But, okay, the topic of baldness can be discussed later. Having placed an unfinished cup of aromatic tea on the table, Trayden asks the protagonist if he has 1 or 2 weeks of free time. Fortunately, Marnak had such a reserve of time. This was great because the request came in, and the customer insisted that Marnak take on the job. According to them, this would be a great job for a demon slayer. They also quickly heard the story of a young man who managed not only to defeat the demon, but also to save the mayor himself. The order was associated with sacred relics of the ancient empire, and the payment for this order was appropriate, 5 gold nip. The reputation and fame of the protagonist increased many times after the recent event, so they were ready to give him the entire payment in advance. And if the customer's team considers the contribution to the study of the ruins significant, then it will share one of the found relics with Marnak. Everything is as the mother of corruption said. It's worth going and taking a look in person. Marnak accepted the order with great joy, because it's not every day that he gets to visit a place with a huge number of divine relics. According to ancient legends, long ago there was an ancient empire, whose founding put an end to the era of mad magicians and united the entire continent. Nowadays, when the people of this world were just recreating the technologies of the ancient empire, precious objects that had magical powers were called sacred relics. Simply put, most of the high-ranking and valuable items in this world were relics of the ancient empire. Marnak came to the appointed place, and having met with the team, introduced himself to them as a priest of the guardian goddess. In the center of the team stood an archer. On the right was a smiling big man, and on the left was a mysterious figure in a dark cape. The person who sent the request to Mr. Trayden was the archer standing in the center, Carmen Valtis. The surname Valtis was familiar to our protagonist, and noticing how Marnak was looking at him, Carmen immediately said that his assumption turned out to be correct. Anthony Waltis from the Black Wolves, his father. But in order to immediately avoid misunderstandings, Carmen clarified what was happening. He was an illegitimate son. Illegitimate? Now this already sounded very interesting. It was hard to imagine that the uncompromising Black Wolf would have an illegitimate son. It seemed that after the death of his wife, he would decide to spend the rest of his days alone. But as it turned out, the initial expectations were far from the truth, just like the rumors that were circulating about him. However, it would be disrespectful of Marnak to delve into this topic. Therefore, he decided not to touch on this topic and asked Carmen to introduce the rest of the team. The magician, who was dressed in a dark robe with a hood, was called Tunisia. She got the role of guide on the way to the sacred relics of the ancient empire. The smiling big guy's name was Sukus. Even though he was from the One-Horn tribe, this did not interfere with the rest of the team, and they could always safely rely on him. It was a great honor for Sukus to meet the demon slayer. Marnak felt uneasy when he was called by such a nickname. Therefore, he asked to be called simply Marnak. Sukus, however, did not understand the protagonist's embarrassment, because there is no need to be ashamed of one's merits, and even at such heroic points. Well, now that they've finished getting acquainted, it's time to hit the road. The journey to the desired destination took about 2 days. It was a bright sunny day outside, and there was not a single cloud in the sky, so nothing prevented our team from communicating with each other along the way. After 2 days, they almost reached their goal, but stopped in the forest to spend the night. In order not to freeze from the local cold, they lit a fire, which served them not only as a source of warmth, but as a kind of source of peace, because when you admire the blazing flames at night in the wilderness, the soul itself begins to calm down. And it seems Carmen wasn't the only one who didn't sleep that night. Carmen was worried about the protagonist's condition, so he asked him to lie down and rest a little more in order to gain strength. But this was not required. Marnak slept quite a bit and was already asleep. The bright moon was shining in the night sky, and there was still a lot of time before sunrise. And since the two of them haven't slept, maybe Marnak will tell some interesting story. Carmen was sure that such a prominent guy during his life managed to have affairs with an impressive number of beautiful girls. But in terms of meeting girls, our protagonist was pure, like snow covering the fields in winter. Carmen was surprised to say the least by this, but if so, what type of girls did Marnak like? When Carmen asked this question, Marnak remembered the mother of corruption that was always next to him. It was not surprising that he liked women who were always ready to be by his side. Carmen agreed with his words. Every time, waking up early in the morning, there was nothing better for him than to see a beauty sleeping peacefully in bed. For Carmen, the main thing was that a woman should have a big heart. And it seems that the mother of corruption liked such words. She even raised her thumb up for the first time. Obviously, the heart is in the chest. And to accommodate all this goodness, women simply must have large breasts. From these words, Carmen began to blush, and his heart beat faster. He adored women with huge breasts. Just imagining how a beautiful lady with magnificent breasts approached him, he began to drool, and his mind was consumed by violent fantasies. And it's good that he knew what kind of women he liked, because clearly, understanding your desires is a very useful quality. And Marnak was sure that this quality would help him more than once in his future travels. But Marnak warned that Carmen should not tell every lady he meets that he likes women with large breasts. Of course, Carmen understood this, and did not tell everyone about it. The protagonist became the only one with whom he shared such a revelation. Every time they communicated, Carmen felt as if he was talking to an old friend whom he had not seen for many years. Marnak experienced similar feelings. He enjoyed spending time with Carmen, not only chatting about beautiful women, but also talking about various topics. The day came. The bright rays of the rising sun illuminated the earthly world. Talking to the mother of corruption, Marnak said he had not forgotten her admonition to be careful about choosing friends. But Marnak was not worried about Carmen, since he was one of the few people with whom he liked to communicate. After walking through the snowy expanse for some more time, our team finally reached the goal. They went to this for 2 days. There was very little left. Taking out the key, Tunisia prepared to open the entrance to the ruins of the ancient empire. Entering the ruins of the ancient empire was quite easy. First, we had to find the key. Then, arrive at the location, whose coordinates were indicated on the key. Next, it was necessary to read the spell in the ancient language, which was engraved on the key. Finally, all that was left was to insert the key and turn it clockwise. Text in the ancient language only magicians were able to read. Therefore, their role in expeditions was irreplaceable. But perhaps the only exception to the rule is the players. Not being a magician, Marnak could read ancient texts, going beyond the usual boundaries of this world. But Marnak preferred to keep this feature secret from everyone. The portal to the ancient ruins opened, and Carmen entered first, calling the entire team behind him. Marnak hid his peculiarity not only for security reasons, but also for logical conclusions. In this world, he had no influential contacts, and without this, it would be difficult to obtain the key. Having walked some way, our team reached ancient ruins, overgrown with grass. Carmen managed to visit many places with ruins, but these are the best preserved. Their appearance excited his consciousness. He had never seen anything like it. He was sure that such ancient ruins contained a huge variety of artifacts. Marnak also experienced a kind of pleasure when looking at ancient buildings. Who would have thought that he would have the chance to visit a place that he had only seen on a computer screen? Tunisia seemed to have no emotion, even realizing what a place they had managed to get into. But they didn't stare at the ancient ruins outside for long, so they continued on their way, delving into distant corridors. And the burning torches they encountered along the way did not allow them to become prisoners of darkness. The interior of the ancient ruins is as well preserved as the exterior. Soon the team came across a giant door covered in ancient writing that glowed blue. "Prove that the blood of the Empire flows in your veins," the ancient writing said. The blood of the Empire. But this had already become a problem, because of which the whole team was noticeably nervous. Not one of them was the owner of the blood of the ancient empire. It was worth preparing for battle. After these words, the doors opened with a creak. The ancient writings were repainted in a bright burgundy color, and a bright red beam came out of the door. A huge crowd of ugly creatures rushed at the team at full speed. There were a huge number of monsters. It seemed that the army was about to tear the whole team to pieces, but Sukus did not feel a drop of fear, even in front of such a huge crowd of previously unseen monsters. Swinging his powerful axe, he destroyed the nearby monsters. Tunisia took the weapon in her hands and began to read the spell. The floor was cracked, and a bright light began to break through from under it. The monsters may have been fast, but they certainly weren't smart, since they fell straight into the magician's trap. There was an explosion of deafening power. Stone blocks flew in different directions, and dozens of monsters were destroyed in the blink of an eye. But even after the explosion, there were still a few monsters left that were capable of fighting. Although fighting was an understatement, even fast speed could not save their sad situation. All that was needed was a few precise and strong blows, which our protagonist coped with without any problems, destroying a huge number of monsters in a few moments. All that was left after them were bones and a black substance. It seemed that all the monsters were finished, but Marnak felt the danger rapidly approaching him. At the last moment, he managed to notice an enemy armed with a sword, and took out his sword and fought back. One of the monsters managed to survive, and driven only by the desire to kill, tried to kill our protagonist. But even such a sudden attempt was initially doomed to failure. All that remained was to make a few smooth movements and put an end to this monster forever. However, the fate of the monster was completed not by the sword of our Marnak, but by an arrow that flew into the head, which crushed the skull and released a black substance. Although Marnak wanted to deal with this monster, he also understood perfectly well that there were some kind of competitors here who also wanted to deal with these creatures. Be that as it may, the creatures of evil spirits were finished. The last monster fell to the ground. Carmen was incredibly pleased with himself and his skill. Although Marnak knew that he could cope with this monster, he thanked his partner. It would seem that everything went smoothly and peacefully, but the angry voice of Sukus forced Marnak and Carmen to be distracted from their thoughts. Sukusa was outraged that Tunisia decided to get rid of the monsters with an explosion, throwing them as close as possible to the team members. But Tunisia's voice was colder than ice. She only calmly replied that this was the simplest way to get rid of the enemy. Sooner or later, they would have killed everyone. But Tunisia could not understand one thing: why Sukus continued to whine like a little girl. Sukus took these words very harshly. A conflict was brewing, and Carmen asked everyone to calm down. The big man felt indescribable anger. Tunisia's behavior infuriated him. At any moment he could lose his temper, and then a bloody conflict would begin between the team. But he managed to restrain his emotions and simply sat on the ground, trying to control his anger, not letting it come out. However, even despite his aggressive state, Sukus was admired by how the protagonist deftly dealt with his opponents. It was not for nothing that he was nicknamed the Demon Slayer. Marnak was ashamed of such behavior. It was not befitting a priest of the guardian goddess. Although Carmen agreed with him, he believed that Marnak did the right thing. And with regards to the way Carmen shot with a bow, Marnak was delighted with such skill and accuracy. It's not surprising, because he used a bow and shot since childhood. While still a very young guy, he trained tirelessly. Through pain, suffering, and fatigue, he achieved the desired results. Unexpectedly, Tunisia intervened in their conversation, asking where they would go next. She was ready to move forward even now. The available mana was sufficient to spare. The crowd of opponents they met on their way was not a problem, and only a small amount of mana was spent on them. Sukus, still irritated, did not understand where Tunisia was in such a hurry. After all, they barely had time to rest. Maybe the magicians who only cast spells did not need a break, but the warriors holding back the enemy vanguard, such as Marnak and Sukus himself, needed at least some rest. But Tunisia was unshakable. Since the others agree with her and are ready to continue, it is better not to sit in one place and quickly reach the end of the ruins. To be honest, Tunisia believed that Sukus was organizing this demonstration performance only to find fault with at least something. These words caused a new outburst of anger in Sukus. It seemed that at any second he would lose control of himself and break down. Observing the current situation, Carmen made a sensible decision, telling him to rest before continuing to walk, and let Sukus and Tunisia finally stop arguing. Otherwise, they behave like little children. Marnak only laughed slightly as he watched the two team members quarrel out of the blue. While the big guy was understandable, it was Tunisia who mostly added fuel to the fire. In this world, those who are called mages are usually extremely arrogant. Most of them are just a bunch of idiots who seem to have a crown on their head. It is extremely easy to become a magician here. It is enough for them to be born. No training, no persistence, just some are born a magician, and some are not. There are small, unnoticeable differences between different people, but those who are born with mana awaken their abilities at a certain age. When this happens, knowledge of the ancient language flows into their minds like a seething stream, and without putting any effort into it, they are able to use ancient spells. The use of mana often violated the laws of the universe. They were reborn as magicians. However, due to the amount of knowledge that fills their heads, they tend to reject everything new. As a result, most magicians become stubborn, uneducated idiots. Most magicians are selfish people who don't care about those around them. And Tunisia was not much different from those magicians whom Marnaku had previously met. But, to be honest, compared to other magicians, she still behaved quite well-mannered, although this did not negate the fact that she was still very selfish, and the opinions of the team, or those around her, were clearly not in the first place for her. Well, some time passed and the team had a good rest. It was impossible to linger for long. It was time to go to the next zone. But instead of moving forward, they stared at the tunnel behind them. Something huge was falling down at rapid speed. A huge block of stone fell to the ground with a deafening roar, blocking the passage back. This came as a huge surprise to the team. But there was something else that made them instantly forget about the door closing behind them. After all, a huge stone monster appeared in front of them. His stone limbs looked as durable as Captain America's shield, and his only eye shone with a bright blue light. Now everything became clear. Marnak suspected that everything could not be so simple. The opponents they had encountered earlier were too weak for such ruins. They were only a small passing stage on the way to the real enemy. In front of them was an enemy hundreds of times stronger than those little monsters. Now the real battle will begin. But Sukus did not feel a drop of fear, even in front of such a strong opponent, and was ready to rush into battle with all his might. Tunisia, however, wanted to be the first to engage in battle. So she told the big man to move away and not block the way. The whole team froze in anticipation of what technique Tunisia would use. And the stone golem, as it appeared, continued to stand in place. Tunisia began to recite a spell in the ancient language. Her wand glowed with a bright blue light, stone fragments separated from the floor and rose into the air. There were only a few moments left before the crushing blow, but the golem did not even think of moving. His single eye shone as brightly as Tunisia's rod. But in this shining gaze, there was something terrible and monstrous. And Carmen seemed to notice this. Goosebumps ran through his body in a crowd, and fear bound his body in icy chains. Tunisia, as usual, acted arrogantly, getting too close to the golem. He tried to warn her of the impending danger, but Tunisia did not succumb to fear. She was not frightened by either the calmness of the golem or the horror that Carmen experienced. A flash appeared above the stone monster. A bright beam struck the golem with rapid speed and terrifying force. The team froze in indescribable surprise, which fell on them like a snowball. There was an explosion of deafening power. Stone fragments flew in all directions. It seemed that the stone monster was finished. But this was just the beginning. Like a ghost, the golem appeared out of nowhere and raised a huge stone hand over Tunisia, whose body was paralyzed by animal terror. The next moment, there was a blow of monstrous power. Blood scattered in all directions. It seemed to this bloody stream there was no end. Sukus, who had previously been full of strength and the desire to rush into battle, froze from silent horror that pierced his body through and through. He fell into a stupor and could not move. Just a moment ago, Tunisia was very close, and now all that was left of her was blood and pieces of her body. Farnak tried to pull his partner out of his paralyzed state, screaming at the top of his lungs, but everything was in vain. Nothing could break the connection with such horror. There was a new explosion. Sukus was mercilessly destroyed by a stone golem. Perhaps he could have been saved if he had been able to overcome the fear that bound him. But we will never know. The stone golem destroyed two of the protagonist's partners. It happened so quickly that it was difficult to comprehend what was happening. Farnak, whose look had previously only expressed horror, changed dramatically. It seems he had an idea. He asks Carmen if he wants to live. Of course he wants to live. It would be strange to hear a different answer. Then Marnak clenched his fist, telling his partner to grit his teeth harder. Carmen just looked at the protagonist in bewilderment while the fist approached his jaw. This blow was as sudden as the appearance of a bloodthirsty stone monster. Carmen tried to comprehend what was happening, but his strength slowly left him, and his eyes closed. A second later, he lost consciousness, and our protagonist could begin executing the plan. He turned to the mother of corruption. There was no time for prayer. Help was needed as quickly as possible, although they were opposed by a merciless stone monster. Fortunately, the protagonist had his own giant in reserve. The golem stared in bewilderment at the white monster that had so unexpectedly appeared above his head, and the white monster took advantage of the fact that the enemy dared to give in. Clenching his palms with such force that veins protruded on his hands, he struck the golem on the head. Taking advantage of the fact that the monster had distracted the golem's attention, Marnak threw Carmen over his shoulder and ran away from the battle. Fortunately, one could always rely on this huge white monster. because even in the most difficult situations, he managed to save the situation. Unfortunately, Tunisia became the first victim of the merciless golem, but her weapon remained intact. There was no time for prayer, so all Marnak could do was absorb the weapon's divinity. He did not forget about the axe that Sukus left behind. The divinity of this weapon was also absorbed. Marnak moved to a safe distance, took Carmen off his shoulder, and sat him down on the floor. They seemed to have moved to a safe distance, but what Marnak saw made him noticeably nervous. Although Golem was weak at the beginning of the battle due to the sudden appearance of the enemy, but now he fought like a merciless killer who knew no mercy, and it seems that this battle will not end quickly. The mother of corruption, who had been silent all this time, suddenly spoke up, ordering the death of the stone golem. Usually Marnak acted on his own, but given what had happened, he was happy to carry out his mother's orders. Activating the letters of corruption, he covered the body with dark green tattoos. Now the games are over. It's time to take Golem seriously. Although the protagonist's monster could not defeat the golem, it held it back well, fighting on equal terms, and Marnak decided to take this chance while the golem was distracted by the monster. His goal was the brightly sparkling crystal in the golem's head. The blue crystal was the only part that stood out against the gray, soulless golem. Since this is the only part of the body that stands out, it is worth paying attention to. Farnak was sure that something was about to happen, because this was the only unprotected place on the body of the impenetrable golem. The monster continued to distract, and Marnak, climbing up, jumped on the golem. The reflection of our protagonist was visible in the bright blue crystal. The golem sensed the approaching danger and raised its head up, but it was too late. Having delivered a cutting blow, Marnak destroyed the crystal, breaking it into small pieces that fell down like crystal rain. Finally, the annoying golem was finished. He already brought enough problems. Sooner or later, it had to end. The white monster, summoned by our protagonist, roared at the top of his lungs, rejoicing at the victory over the enemy. But this goal was achieved only through joint efforts, and Marnak was grateful to the white giant for his help. It would seem that everything has come to an end, but the mother of corruption did not think so. Marnak, perplexed, asks what's the matter. The situation became even worse than one could imagine. 3 golems, the same as the one defeated, appeared from the unexpectedly opened portals. He barely managed to cope with only 1 golem, and then thanks to the help of the white giant, and now 3 appeared at once. Their appearance caused a shiver in the heart of our protagonist. There were only a few seconds left to think about further actions. Even the white monster trembled. Who knows how many more there are? What if there are dozens, hundreds, thousands more of the same unkillable creatures hiding on the other side of the portal? Some time passed, Carmen woke up, and the first thing he asked was whether his partners were dead. Unfortunately, yes. Marnak tried to save them, but there was no such opportunity. Everything happened too quickly. Marnak was saddened by the loss of his allies, but Carmen felt 10 times worse. He regretted that he had not activated the key at the moment of meeting the golem. He met them quite recently, involving them in this adventure, and now, they both became victims of his greed. Marnak tried to reason with him, explaining that they were not going on a picnic. Everyone was aware of what could happen to them, so Carmen must stop blaming himself. What happened cannot be corrected. Okay, that's clear. But what kind of place is this? This room seemed unfamiliar to him. Marnak says that they are behind the black door. What? But how is this possible? How could it be that they ended up behind that huge stone door? However, upon reflection, Carmen understood the possible reason for such a mysterious event. Although he did not know what really happened, he suspected that Marnak was somehow involved in it, but it would be indecent to ask about what he hid by knocking him out. Therefore, Carmen did not ask the protagonist about what happened, and besides, he saved his life. He vowed to pay off this debt at all costs. Marnak said that he would look forward to this. Since Carmen has come to his senses, it is time to continue moving towards the goal. And as for those golems, the protagonist did not destroy them, but ran away from them. After he destroyed one of the golems with the help of a giant of corruption, 3 more of the same ones fell from the ceiling. And then Marnak left the giant as a punching bag. Taking advantage of the fact that the golems were distracted, he barely lifted the doors, threw Carmen in, and then jumped in himself. Since Marnak told the giant to return when he had completely figured it out, one could only hope that the giant upon his return would not be offended by such an order. The day turned out to be sad, but even despite the death of allies, we must continue to go, and it looks like the long-awaited journey has finally come to an end. Marnak and Carmen reached another wooden door. It seemed they had reached the end of the ruins, but Carmen wanted to explore this place first. However, there was no time to look at the interiors of the dungeon forever, as they say, and going inside, they opened the door with a creak. Several sacred relics appeared before them, floating in the air on a shining altar. Who would have thought that stories from books, previously considered only legends, would turn out to be true? Although now was not the right time for this, Carmen decided to ask for a request. "Do you mind if I take that necklace over there?" said Carmen, examining the relic with a shiny metal circle. Carmen was even ready to pay the protagonist a decent price for this relic. It was then that Marnak asked, "What kind of necklace is this, since he is even ready to pay for it?" The necklace that Carmen so desired was called the Ancestry Seeker. The essence of the magic of this relic was that if you spill a little blood on it and think about the bloodline you are looking for, the necklace will show the way to the nearest bearer of the same blood. Simply put, this is some kind of navigator. At least Carmen's plan was clear and understandable. He needed the relic in order to finally find his mother, whom he had never seen. Marnak stood silently, listening to every word of his interlocutor, smiling very strangely. "Okay," said Marnak, looking directly at his partner. "Do you mind if I take this sword?" he asked the protagonist enthusiastically, showing genuine interest in the second relic, which still continued to float on the shining altar. Well, everyone got their own relic, obtained at a terrible price. Having got out of the dungeon, they returned to the same forest clearing where they had stopped the previous night and lit a fire, collecting a couple of large dry branches. The day turned out to be quite eventful, and Carmen no longer wanted to see monsters like those golems. Marnak agreed with this, also not wanting to see those creatures again. If they had stayed even for a few moments, these huge monsters would have immediately smeared them across the walls, sprinkling the walls with fresh blood. In the last moments before leaving the ancient ruins, Carmen repeatedly had thoughts that they would not be able to escape, and they would repeat the sad fate of their allies. But fortunately, everything worked out, and while Carmen was happy that they managed to get out of this damned place, Marnak watched the blazing flames of the fire, but he was distracted by Carmen, who suddenly turned to him. Having wrapped a necklace shining in the moonlight around his fingers, Carmen asked our protagonist to bless him. Of course, he did just that, as it seemed to Carmen, because for him our protagonist still remained a servant of the guardian goddess. Carmen was immensely grateful to Marnak, seeing this meant much more to him than any person could even imagine. Taking out a small knife that looked more like a small paintbrush, Carmen made a neat cut, and blood flowed from his finger. He brought the necklace closer, and lightly pressing on his finger increased the flow of blood to the cut site. The formed drop of blood fell onto the shiny circle necklace, slowly spreading in all directions. At the same instant, a strange energy gushed out of the necklace in a rapid stream. This meant that the necklace had completed its task, and looking at it, Carmen burst into a smile of sincere happiness. Carmen had great hopes that he would be able to find his own mother, and having formed a kind of arrow, the relic justified these hopes. His mother was alive. Seeing how happy Carmen was, Marnak said that he was also happy not only for him, but also for the fact that the necklace was working as expected. None of this would have happened if not for Marnak's help. That's what Carmen thought. The question arose in his head about how to pay the protagonist for such help. Whatever it was, Marnak was ready to accept the gratitude with respect. However, Carmen had one request, which the protagonist decided to listen to. Anyway, here's the gist. Carmen wanted Marnak to continue working with him until they managed to find his mother. Hearing such an unexpected proposal, Marnak looked at his interlocutor with uncomprehending eyes. Since Marnak is heading west anyway, they can go together, and on the way visit the capital, where Carmen will be able to get money to pay the reward for the task. And given that the road to the capital took a lot of time, Carmen took on all travel expenses himself. Carmen finished his speech, and Marnak smiled a strange and mysterious smile, revealing snow-white teeth. His eyes and smile were as sharp as butcher's knives. He wouldn't mind agreeing, but then Carmen will figure out the true intentions that he managed to hide all this time. The fire continued to burn, and from time to time, the crackling of firewood was heard, breaking the impending silence. Carmen was still waiting for the protagonist's answer. The radiant smile did not leave his face. As if sensing Marnak's true intentions, the fire burned with renewed vigor. The wood crackled even more, and the tension increased with every moment. Marnak had been silent for quite a long time, which made Carmen nervous and tremble like a leaf. Marnak's smile became more and more creepy. He decided to stall for time, slightly intimidating his comrade, so that he would not treat him lightly. Deciding not to overdo the tension, Marnak finally spoke, replacing his bestial grin with a bright, good-natured smile. He said that he would gladly provide support to his comrade. Looking up, they saw the bright moon, illuminating the way for night travelers around the world. "Are you leaving already? So fast? And this after everything I've done for you?" Aaron said indignantly, looking at our protagonist with dissatisfaction. From her reaction, it was clear that she was not prepared for such an unexpected outcome. Quite a bit of time had passed since they became a little closer, and now Marnak, quite unexpectedly, decided to head to the capital. She asked to give her hand, to which Marnak, in bewilderment, asked what it was for. Without giving an answer, Aaron repeated her request. Marnak extended his hand and began to wait for Aaron's further actions, and they did not take long to arrive. She put some object in his hand, saying that his teaching was very difficult. He had to make every effort. Seeing a shiny object in his hand, Marnak found it hard to believe that this was really true. In Marnak's hand was the badge of a silver-rank mercenary, obtained by Aaron through back-breaking labor, and she really hoped that the protagonist was not an idiot and knew what to say in such a case. Marnak thought he should just say thank you when receiving such a valuable item, but an exasperated Aaron made it clear that he was dead wrong. The mercenary's badge was not a thank you, but a promise to return. "This is what you have to say now. You have to make a promise to come back," Aaron said, with a slight hint of disappointment in her voice. Marnak was sorry that he may have offended Aaron, but given that he lived the life of a vagabond, wandering around this vast world, this promise, unfortunately, was not destined to be fulfilled. As if reading the thoughts of the protagonist, Aaron, with a slight sadness in her voice, tried to convey one thought to him. If he continues to live like this, wandering here and there, he will never marry, dying alone, forgotten by everyone. And since Marnak didn't have the courage to say it, Aaron decided to say it for him. "See you again," Aaron said in a voice as gentle as birdsong. She hoped to meet him again, sometime when the opportunity arose again. And glancing briefly at the notice board, where a lot of pieces of paper hung, she said that such an opportunity was provided much less often than one might imagine. "Okay, but what does this mean?" Without allowing the protagonist to speak, she pointed her finger at his lips, deciding that he did not need to know this detail. Let him just remember that this is her parting gift, a kind of punishment. The conversation with Aaron turned out to be quite strange, leaving behind a considerable number of questions. But Marnak did not linger and went to the mayor Tredin, who was already showing side effects. The perfect bald head shone like precious metal in the light of day. The side effect made itself felt a little faster than expected. But this did not depress Tredin. Quite the contrary, he even slightly made fun of himself, saying that he had only become one step closer to the natural image of a person. Tredon may have been a humorous man, but he was also a businesslike man, so he quickly changed the topic of conversation. Information reached him that the protagonist was going to head to the capital, and therefore, he prepared one thing in advance as soon as he heard this news. Tredon handed Marnak a letter of recommendation in a white envelope, sealed with a red seal. Tredon would not mind paying our protagonist, but the renovation of the city cost a large sum. And as they said, there was not a penny in his pocket. A letter of recommendation from the mayor was at least something Tredon could give back. In addition to this, his friend was in the capital, who would help if anything happened. However, according to Tredon, it was very difficult to conduct a dialogue with this mysterious man, so Tredon advised the protagonist not to tempt fate once again, and to contact his friend only when absolutely necessary. Although these were not gold coins, Marnak was grateful for such a gift. After all, a letter of recommendation from the mayor could help. Tredon said that he gave him this letter of recommendation not only as payment, but also as a sign of friendship. Saying goodbye to Marnak, Tredon hoped that his life would turn out for the best. After all, life is complex, short, and unpredictable. Several days have passed since Marnak and Carmen left the city. They moved through the snowy area, leaving behind long traces of their shoe prints. The path to the capital was not close, but fortunately, the next city called Kelton was about half a day away. And while they walked, Carmen did not even suspect that, or rather who, was hiding under the protagonist's cloak. The mother of corruption was still not happy with Carmen. However, she had nothing against Marnak traveling with him, since Carmen was rated 3.5 fingers. By collecting the divinity of such a target, Marnak could gain another ability. It was rare to find a person who had the potential to reach 4 fingers. Although, to be honest, Marnak liked Carmen's cheerful character, and he preferred to see such a person alive rather than dead buried deep, somewhere under the damp earth. Everything was calm, but suddenly, the protagonist was overcome with a feeling of rapidly approaching danger. From the moment they left the ruins of the ancient empire, Marnak had never drawn his sword, until now. Carmen felt a sense of alarm when he saw his friend's strange behavior. The first thing he asked was what exactly was the matter. Blood. The smell of blood was clearly felt, somewhere very nearby. What had such a huge supply of blood was rapidly approaching? Marnak seemed to see this something, lurking somewhere in the snowdrifts. But Carmen didn't understand why the partner was behaving so strangely. The pupils dilated, and the feeling of anxiety grew rapidly. But this feeling was interrupted by a sound that came from behind. Somewhere above, blocking the rays of the sun, a huge spider was hovering in the air, tightly holding onto a snow-white web woven from thousands of small fibers, tens of times stronger than steel. The huge monster moved with such speed that it was barely possible to catch its phantom silhouettes. But seeing the prey, the monster stopped, securing itself with long and sticky paws on the top of the trees. A snow spider covered with gray skin looked at Carmen with a dozen red crazy eyes, greedily devouring its prey. Rising from the trees like a mad dog with an insatiable hunger, the spider brutally rushed at Carmen. Taking out his bow and pulling the string, Carmen aimed at the eyes of the mad monster, hoping to hit and blind the mad monster. But there was no need for this, because Marnak entered the battle against the snowy inhabitant of these lands, delivering a cutting blow to the body. The spider became a victim of his own desires. Counting on easy prey, he forgot about self-defense, for which he paid. One blow was enough for part of the snow spider's body to come off, and Marnak himself experienced a monstrous pleasure that filled his mind. Although there was one unpleasant detail. The spider's blood stained not only the sword shining in daylight, but also the protagonist's clothes. A feeling of excitement, mixed with madness, fell on Marnak like a snowball. The sword splashes too much blood and remnants of flesh. Although judging by the devilish smile, Marnak did not see this as a problem at all, rather a way to have fun by destroying another creature. And while Marnak and Carmen were fighting with the danger looming over them, one interesting event took place in the city they had recently left. A blue-haired girl already familiar to us came to see Traden. He apologized deeply for receiving her in his office, since the living room was destroyed. However, she was not at all worried about these problems. Okay, but Traden was interested in the purpose of her visit, since the blue flame of the Order of the Torch does not often look into the pilgrimage. The girl held out a white sheet of paper, asking the mayor to take a look at it. Traden picked up the sheet from the table and began to examine it with an interested look, and the girl asked if he had ever seen this guy. The paper depicted a portrait of a guy with disheveled hair. The lines were not very clear, and in some places there was a feeling that the picture was drawn by some child. But even so, Traden, with a sinking heart, recognized this guy as Marnak. All this seemed quite strange, and without revealing his surprise, Traden asked the girl why she was looking for this young man. The girl did not go into details, saying that she had personal reasons for this. Traden looked at her knowingly, but said that no one like him came to mind. And if there are no other questions besides this, then it's time to say goodbye. In the current state of the city, Traden had no extra time for friendly conversations. There were plenty of problems that required immediate solutions. The girl did not become persistent and treated the situation with understanding. Without stopping, she headed for the exit and walked away. Traden was not a stupid man, and he suspected that such an important person was looking for his friend. Clearly not with good intentions. In any case, Traden was sure that Marnak would be fine, even if he did not send him a message. And Traden was right. Marnak and Carmen defeated not one, but 3 snow spiders at once. And while Marnak examined their dead bodies, Carmen cut the flesh of one of the spiders and began to look for something in his body. Watching his friend look for something with genuine interest, Marnak asked him, "What is he doing?" Continuing to dig into the spider's body, Carmen said that he was looking for the poisonous glands of the snow spider. Marnak had no idea about this, unlike Carmen. According to him, the venom of the snow spider had a strong paralyzing effect, and the range of its use was quite wide. It was possible to smear the arrowheads with poison or sell them for a good price. Marnak wondered, how did such a young rich man know about such things? It turned out that Carmen had repeatedly participated in hunting monsters. There is nothing better than learning by doing, because wild and angry monsters who want to kill will never give in. One of the body parts that Carmen had cut up spattered more blood than expected. Then Marnak suggested he do the cutting, since he was covered in blood. Let him just tell him where the glands were. But Carmen wanted to do things differently. He decided to teach the protagonist how to extract glands and then cut them together. Moreover, Kelton was not so far away. The weather was beautiful. There wasn't a single dark cloud in the sky. And although a fresh winter breeze was blowing on one side, on the other, our company emanated a not particularly pleasant smell, and they decided to take a bath first thing when they got to the city. Some time passed, and from the dim lighting it was clear that sunset was approaching. Two men, dressed in winter clothes, looked into the distance with extreme surprise. Coming out of the forest thicket, Carmen and Marnak entered the open area, and there were only a couple of tens of meters left to the city. One of the men ran up to our company at full speed. In his eyes, there was an indescribable surprise that arose immediately after the appearance of the protagonist and his partner. There was only one question that remained, gripping his head with a tight grip. How did they get here? However, Carmen and Marnak did not understand why this man was so surprised. Marnak said that they just got here on foot, and Carmen, scratching the back of his head, still could not understand what the man meant. However, in the next second it became clear why the man was so surprised. For 3 days now, Kelton has been under siege, surrounded by monsters. This sounded quite unexpected, and the protagonist asked the man to clarify the situation in more detail. Recently, attacks have become more frequent, but when they searched the places where monster attacks took place, there were no traces of a battle. Not even bodies remained. There weren't even bodies left of people caught by surprise by snow spiders. But this already sounded really strange, because Carmen knew a lot about these creatures. Snow spiders sucked all the blood from their victim, to the last drop, leaving only a lifeless body covered with thin skin on the skeleton. Therefore, in this way, it was extremely difficult not to leave any traces behind. Such an unexpected flow of information forced each of them to plunge into thought, but they were pulled out of this state by an approaching loud male voice. The second man who stood at the entrance shouted that Lord Strawn wanted to see Carmen and Marnak, and so as not to waste precious time, the man said that he would accompany them to the Lord's estate. Smiling, they looked at each other. The Lord would not just call them, so there was something important. When Marnak and Carmen arrived at the estate, they were greeted by a slightly chubby man with a small mustache on the sides. With tears of happiness slowly flowing down his face, he was glad that they had arrived in the city. Marnak had already heard about the situation with the monsters. It was for this reason that Stren immediately ordered the servants to lead them to the estate. But the situation turned out to be much more complicated than it initially seemed. The monsters were just pawns in this crazy game. The real players on the battlefield were the followers of the evil spirit. They were the ones behind everything that was happening. Even if this was so, Marnak could not understand one thing. Doesn't it seem to Stren that blocking all the roads leading to the city is an impossible task for a handful of followers? It may be impossible for a handful, but the fact is that at least 4 different sects have been seen working together to cut Kelton off from other cities. But Kelton was the most ordinary city, in no way standing out from the rest. And all this began to happen immediately after Stren was elevated to the post of new mayor. The problems that arose were difficult for him, and being in despair, Stren remembered his deceased father, who would certainly have found a way out of the current situation. At least there were still enough food supplies. And even despite the oppressive atmosphere, the morale of the guards was high. And in principle, everything was relatively good. But since Kelton was cut off from the rest of the world quite suddenly, no one even had any idea that the city was under siege. All the cities continued to live their normal lives, taking care of their problems, not even remotely suspecting what was happening there, somewhere in the distance, behind the dense forests. Therefore, someone was needed who could break through the blockade of the merciless monsters and convey news of Kelton's sad situation to other cities. For this task, a detachment of people was needed, who were even ready to sacrifice themselves to complete such an important task. So far, the situation in the city was not catastrophic. There was still food. But sooner or later the food could run out, and it is unknown how the monsters will behave further. Then the city will either die of starvation, plunging into chaos, or will be destroyed by a horde of ruthless monsters, which is clearly not averse to tasting human flesh. Understanding the seriousness and danger of the situation, Marnak agreed to help the city with all his might. The sun set behind the horizon, and gradually night fell on the city. The dissatisfied mother of corruption was not happy with the decision made by the protagonist, and Marnak did not understand why his mother wanted him to simply slap the mare and leave. This was too much. At least they received a small gift from the flow seekers. This item could only be found in the western desert, and Marnak would never have thought that he would be able to obtain it here. Now at least we won't have to worry about washing up after gutting the monsters, the thought drifted off. Moreover, the mother herself said that the sword will become sharper if it is soaked in water. Oh well, the main thing is to live life to the fullest, he said. Slapping his hands together, Marnak made the shining object disappear. The item was moved to the protagonist's inventory, just like in a computer game. He always wanted to say this, and with regards to recent conversations with Stren, Marnak agreed to the request, not because he liked him, but because the situation seemed to him an omen of the beginning of the main quest, and there was a good reason for that. 4 different sects suddenly began to work together out of the blue. Although the title of an evil spirit sounded quite threatening, it meant little in the game. It is simply a label that the major deities attach to their opponents, making them the target of persecution. However, one thing was certain. Among the followers of the evil spirit, sane people were rarely found. Therefore, unlike orders, which tended to unite to confront evil spirits, sects usually rarely interacted with each other. Therefore, the feeling that something was approaching stuck in the protagonist's head with a very strong grip. For sects of evil spirits to surround the city with their joint efforts, this is something unusual, even very unusual. Therefore, a detachment of several people on horseback, led by Marnak, moved towards danger. Everything seemed to be calm, but when Carmen turned around, he saw something that instantly made him change his mind about the current situation. Like ghosts appearing out of nowhere, several snow spiders jumped out at the team. At that moment, the protagonist realized that the time had come for his plan. Turning to Carmen, he said that he would distract these creatures to himself. Carmen thought that his partner had gone crazy. Even for a strong type like Marnak, it was dangerous to go out alone against such a crowd. Marnak tried to explain to his comrade that if everything continued like this, they would both be captured. And given the speed of these creatures, they would not be able to escape. Carmen looked at his comrade with wild horror in his eyes. Marnak was not going to retreat from his plan and ordered Carmen to bring reinforcements. A blue flash that appeared from nowhere hit the protagonist, throwing him off his horse. Carmen couldn't believe his eyes. Fear and horror grabbed him tightly with their clawed paws, not wanting to let go. Although Marnak did not feel a drop of fear and asked the mother of corruption, was it cool for him to say all this to his comrade? A few moments later, the protagonist's body flew into a snowdrift, and the snow scattered in all directions. Carmen wanted to return and help his comrade, but at the same time, he was well aware that if he returned, he would become another victim of ruthless monsters. All they could do was ride horses as quickly as possible, moving further and further from the city. Meanwhile, monsters that looked like wolves were approaching our protagonist, revealing their snow-white and sharp fangs. But besides these wolves, snow spiders were also approaching, greedily looking at the protagonist with their red, crazy eyes. A huge crowd of deadly and ruthless monsters, ranging from very tiny creatures to giant spiders, snakes, and other creatures of the worst nightmares, was rapidly approaching the protagonist. Marnak couldn't believe his ears. Mother of Corruption found the protagonist's acting quite interesting and intriguing, which made him bare his snow-white teeth in a devilish smile. Happy to receive his mother's compliment, Marnak activated his sword, and hundreds of small blades began to spin at a frantic speed. The time has come to find the followers of evil spirits, who have been hiding behind the monsters all this time. A crowd of ruthless and hungry monsters wanting to taste human flesh was rapidly approaching the protagonist. However, all they encountered was death from Marnak's lightning strikes. There was no chance that the monsters would survive this bloodbath. Pieces of the body were everywhere, and the blood spread in a rapid stream in all directions. Even the snow spiders, who had previously mercilessly killed hundreds, if not thousands of people, experienced a burning fear of Marnak. Monsters, which were considered the curse of this world, became victims of the merciless Marnak, who destroyed everyone in his path. Pain, fear, and despair merged into a bloody symphony, slowly playing on the merciless battlefield. The monsters were defeated, but not everything was so perfect. Marnak was again stained with thick blood that began to soak into his clothes. At this rate, if he gets into trouble like this every day, he'll have to carry a bathtub with him. But in any case, this could have been thought about later. The followers of the evil spirit knew for sure that Marnak was coming after their soul, but it seemed that none of them wanted to come out and greet the protagonist in person. Very interesting. What did he do to deserve such a disrespectful attitude towards himself? And what's wrong with Marnak destroying a ruthless crowd of monsters? Is it really possible to show such disrespect over such a small thing? Marnak, of course, wanted to hear answers to these questions, but he needed to move on. Entering the rocky cave, Marnak found himself in a place illuminated by dim light. The atmosphere here was, to put it mildly, not comfortable. The oppressive atmosphere pressed on the subconscious. Walking around the cave and taking a fleeting glance at the objects lying nearby, Marnak remembered how the Lord told him that the carts that were attacked remained empty. It seemed that the monsters were dragging everything away from there. The protagonist continued to examine the cave, but immediately stopped when he saw someone's hand in front of him. Shifting his gaze slightly, Marnak immediately saw the owner of this hand. On the stone and damp floor lay a dead traveler, from whom the snow spiders had already managed to profit. His face was frozen in a grimace of horror, and instead of eyes there was only a black, impenetrable abyss. Although they were monsters, they acted according to animal instincts, and Marnak could understand their desire for a tasty dinner. But why do spiders use leftover food as decoration? The snow spider designers were, to put it mildly, not very good. The mother of corruption began to worry about her only follower because he was too distracted by the cocoons hanging on the ceiling. But Marnak convinced her otherwise. Even despite his curiosity, he never let his guard down. And yet there was one strange thing about the whole situation. Snow spiders have grabbed too many people. There is no way they can eat this entire supply in 3 days. Are they really preparing food for their children, the future generation of bloodsuckers? But be that as it may, it was necessary to move on, since a huge number of cocoons were observed. But the inhabitants of this place were still nowhere to be seen. The tunnels near this cave were simply huge. It seemed as if several giants lived here at once. However, in addition to this, Marnak constantly sensed someone's divinity. At first it was only a distant sensation, but as soon as he entered here, it increased exponentially. The only question that remained was why the inhabitants of this place would not come out of hiding. They would not be able to hide forever anyway. Looking at the ceiling, Marnak saw thousands of eyes red as blood, greedily devouring him. Marnak knew full well that the snow crawlers were here, and there was no point in hiding. From all sides, the protagonist was surrounded by thousands of snow spiders. These creatures did not stand out in any way, except perhaps in quantity. But from above, like a cobblestone of death, a huge spider fell on him, baring its sharp fangs. The landing spider kicked up a huge amount of dust into the air. A genuine interest in this creation appeared in the eyes of the protagonist, and turning to the mother of corruption, he asked her if she would deign to draw the line of corruption around him. The mother of corruption immediately fulfilled her follower's request. A bright green flame appeared around the protagonist, tearing up the ground. A satisfied grin appeared on Marnak's face. The snow spider queen was already hanging from above, baring her huge fangs and devouring Marnak with her red, huge, crazy eyes. Marnak did not want to leave his beloved mother of corruption without a gift. But even being confident in his own abilities, he understood that he himself could not cope with such a huge monster, and therefore he called his monster, a white giant, to help. Such a huge creature was ideal for helping the protagonist get the head of the Spider Queen. Accelerating at full speed, the white giant struck the Spider Queen. Although the giant had enormous strength, this time it was impossible to treat the golems like last time. Having activated the damage in writing, Marnak became covered with green tattoos, preparing to enter into battle against a huge spider. Although the Spider Queen was taken by surprise, she quickly returned to the battle, stabbing her sharp paws into the giant's body. Now in her red eyes, there was a monstrous anger that enveloped her mind. 2 huge monsters entered into battle, and the Spider Queen was about twice the size of the protagonist's ally. But not only that, she also had thousands of minions. Her red, maddened eyes did not bode well. It was necessary to come up with something urgently to help the white giant. Although he possessed enormous strength, he would hardly have been able to withstand such a huge monster for long. Meanwhile, the snow spiders tried to deal with the protagonist. But all their attempts were in vain. Blood and scattered remains of bodies filled the entire cave. But this is not the main thing, because Marnak felt the divinity concentrated in the body of the Spider Queen. Therefore, it was necessary to act carefully so as not to damage it. Any monster, even the largest one, had a weak point, and the Queen of Spiders had it somewhere. All that remained was to understand where exactly it was. But from these reflections of the protagonist, a snow spider suddenly appeared above his head. Jumping up, he delivered a cutting blow across the monster's body. With a deafening roar, the snow spider's body, cut in half, fell to the ground. Now everything has become clear. The Spider Queen's divinity, felt by the protagonist all this time, was in her chest. All that remained was to get to the queen and cut off the desired part of the body. The white giant was already gradually losing strength, fighting with such a deadly and evil enemy. But hearing the voice of Marnak, who ordered not to let go of this creature, the white giant experienced a new influx of strength. This time, Marnak did not plan to leave his giant to the mercy of fate and rushed to his aid at full speed. All the white giant had to do was distract the Spider Queen, and perhaps the giant coped with this task perfectly. Rage filled his entire body, and the roar he emitted was so loud that he could lose his hearing. The giant grabbed the Spider Queen's paw, squeezing it with such a deadly grip that it was impossible to free himself. Using his remaining hands, he grabbed the rest of the queen's limbs. At that moment, for the first time ever, indescribable horror appeared on the Spider Queen's face. The giant could only hold the Spider Queen while Marnak quickly approached, running along the wall. Even being damn huge in size, the spider remained a spider, with its weaknesses and shortcomings. It was only necessary to strike one precise blow in the right place. The Spider Queen and her skin were like an impregnable fortress that could not be penetrated. But there was one weak point in the middle of the body, the thinnest. It was this part that could succumb to the protagonist's blow. It was necessary to make only one, but deadly movement, in order to inflict irreparable damage in an instant. Indescribable horror appeared in the eyes of the Spider Queen from the realization that the enemy had found her weak point. However, one blow was not enough to cut off part of the body. Then the protagonist delivered a multiple series of blows, cutting the flesh with the blades of his swords. Pieces of bodies scattered throughout the cave, and blood poured onto the floor in a thick stream. Terrifying pain and animal horror filled the consciousness of the Spider Queen. She had never experienced such terrible torment. However, this part of the body was still holding on. Although it was difficult to say that it was holding on, just a few tense muscles still somehow connected the two parts of the body. And now, the last blow, which finally completed what had started. With a slimy sound, the protagonist's sword cut the Spider Queen's body in two. Before this, the huge monster, even by the standards of a white giant, became the same size as him. And now holding the helpless body of the Spider Queen has become much easier for the white giant. In desperation, the Spider Queen tried to crawl into the distance of the cave, but the giant held her in a death grip while Marnak cut off her legs. The Spider Queen's body fell dead, and Marnak jumped to the side. It would seem that everything was over, but the giant still remembered how the protagonist fled from the battlefield, leaving him to the mercy of fate among three ruthless golems, and it seems that these memories did not give him pleasant feelings. Realizing what he had done, Marnak apologized to his huge white friend. It was difficult to understand whether the white giant had forgiven the protagonist or not. He only growled at the top of his lungs. At least Marnak was glad that the giants did not hit him. The Spider Queen was finished. But unexpectedly, his attention was attracted by an aggressive female voice heard nearby. It was a girl with gray skin and hair as black as night. And from the anger that was seething in her body, the gnashing of teeth could be heard from time to time. She called the protagonist everything she could. Ugly, asshole, and more. In general, she made it clear that she was not happy to see Marnak. But Marnak did not react in any way to these insults. They were just fleeting noise that flew through his ears. His only concern was that he was convinced of his guesses, which appeared at the beginning of the battle. Somewhere there, deep in his thoughts, he suspected that there was actually a person behind what was happening. "To hell with you," the girl said angrily, crawling out of the body of the Spider Queen. She still couldn't understand who the protagonist was to so brazenly ruin her brilliant plans. Moreover, he is the same follower of the evil spirit as she is. "You freak, can you at least imagine how long it took me to subdue the queen?" the girl said angrily. But the protagonist didn't care how long it took her, or how much effort she spent to accomplish her plan. The only question that interested him: for what purpose did they surround Kelton? But why on earth should she tell some stranger her plans, and even after he ruined everything? Then, to force her to be more talkative, Marnak plunged the tip of his sword into her shoulder. A fleeting scream was heard, describing the pain that the girl experienced. Marnak again asked for what purpose they surrounded the Kelton. It was clear from his angry expression that he didn't like to ask twice, so the girl had better be more accommodating. But this time, she didn't say anything, only throwing a few sharp insults at the protagonist. Then Marnak pressed the sword even harder, driving it deeper into the flesh. The protagonist's patience was coming to an end, and he once again asked, why did they surround Kelton? The girl, therefore, experienced monstrous pain throughout her body. But this only made her smile. It was preferable for her to die than to tell Marnak anything, and what would he do then? Okay, as you wish, but remember you signed your own death warrant, said Marnak in a crazy, but at the same time calm, peaceful voice. At that moment, animal horror appeared on the girl's face. She hoped that a simple manipulation would make Marnak retreat, but it seems that she did not meet the person she expected. Marnak did not delay in fulfilling the girl's last wish, and gracefully turned around and struck the neck. The girl's body fell dead. Blood sprinkled the shining sword, and her head flew off 10 meters. The girl's head glowed with a bright green flame, and the protagonist received 1,000 divinity. This follower of the evil spirit turned out to be less accommodating, and now the question arose, which follower will tell the whole truth? The mother of corruption bet that the third follower would not be stupid and would tell the whole plan in great detail. Since they had started a game of sorts, Marnak bet that the fourth would be successful for them. Leaving the cave, Marnak decided to burn everything that was here, and in the blink of an eye, the entire cave burst into flames with green flame. Having finished with the problems that had arisen, Marnak slowly walked back towards the city. The cave was located not far from the city, so the protagonist reached the outskirts of Kelton relatively quickly. But the picture of what was happening was seriously alarming. The city was shrouded in merciless flames, and every now and then, the screams and cries of helpless people trapped in a fiery trap were heard. It seems that the followers of the evil spirit decided not to wait and began executing the plan earlier than expected. And how did this fat pig manage to escape so quickly? Has he been practicing since birth? The girl said, in an aggressive voice, looking at the lifeless body of the mayor. 3 people gathered around the body. It seemed that these were the same followers of the evil spirit. The black-haired girl was outraged by the fact that the guards were protecting this fat man just because he was a noble, wasting their precious time. A man dressed in an elegant black suit asked how things were going with the incarnation. Parna, the girl with black hair, said it was still unstable. You yourself know that extracting divinity from living beings is not an easy task. The third member of the company suddenly intervened in the conversation. It was a girl with blonde hair, and while continuing the conversation, she did not forget to mention that before the preparations were completed, thanks to someone, they lost several test subjects. Now, not only was the implementation of the plan delayed, but also the chances of success were rapidly falling. Parna was clearly not happy to hear such words from her ally. She was outraged by the fact that the girl thought she did it on purpose. She gave it her all, doing everything possible to implement the plan. However, those 2 beefy monks and some freak from the Order of Enlightenment became a problem for her, which constantly got in the way. It would have been much easier if Layla had sent them a few spiders to help them, but that didn't happen, and the guy with the bow eventually managed to escape. And she was talking about none other than Carmen, who ran away from them as fast as he could, and ultimately ran away from them. Speaking of Layla, the girl with blonde hair noticed the fact that she still had not appeared. Unlike this girl, Parna did not have much control over her emotions. This was not the first time Layla and her spiders had wasted their time, and even if she deigned to bring her damn spiders here, she would simply play with the corpses somewhere nearby. The man with yellow hair was tired of listening to senseless quarrels, and looking menacingly at the girl, he told her to stop. There was no point in arranging conflicts among themselves, and since Carmen managed to escape, punitive squads will soon be sent to kill them. It's only a matter of time. The man said that they should not forget how many years they have been preparing for this day. Parna told him not to forget that she also spent 3 years of her life for all this. And in general, why did he suddenly imagine himself as a leader? The girl is already pretty tired of everyone. First, the girl made claims against her, and now the man dared to think that she let Carmen go because she wanted to. If so, let him yell at her again. Let him say again that she missed Carmen. By the way, Parna noticed that something is wrong with the blonde girl today. Is it really possible that a man does not pay enough attention to her in a romantic relationship, especially in bed? She knew very well that these two had become very close lately. The girl decided not to add fuel to the already blazing fire and turned around and said that she would go and see how things were going outside. Parna asked indignantly, "Does she really think that people will think that without her, nothing would have worked out for them?" The man said that Parna should finally stop this melodrama. It's time to stop this. And with regards to the runaway rat, the man assured that he would make sure that Layla took responsibility for what happened. Finally, for the first time in all time, a smile appeared on the face of the always angry and somehow dissatisfied Parna. Well, if this is how the issue with the escaped rat is resolved, then so be it, it will shut up. And while she was saying this, someone's familiar head was already flying past her, but she didn't notice it yet. However, the next moment, turning her gaze to the other side, she saw something that made her experience terrible fear. In the reflection of her eyes, the severed head of the blonde girl with whom she had spoken just a few seconds ago was clearly visible. The girl watched in horror as the stranger cut off the girl's head in one deadly quick movement, and again, the sword was covered in blood, and hundreds of small blades, spinning at incredible speed, scattered small remnants of flesh stuck on them. Everything happened very quickly. The man barely had time to realize the fact of what was happening, while the shadow of a deadly weapon was already hovering over his head. It was at that moment, when the realization of everything that was happening reached the man, that Marnak delivered one single blow, cutting the man in two. Blood stained the floor, walls, and ceiling, and small pieces of flesh scattered in all directions. Thor, who was watching what was happening, froze from the animal horror that shackled her body, and her heart was beating at such a speed as if it was ready to jump out of her chest at any moment, tearing her chest to shreds. Before her stood the embodiment of a real monster, who destroyed two of her allies in just a few seconds. His eyes glowed with a bright green light, his lower jaw looked like an exposed skull, and his gaze expressed only rage, anger, and hatred. He looked at the girl like she was a helpless prey, but suddenly, the protagonist stopped and began to talk to the mother of corruption. He was well aware that he had acted dishonestly by killing the third consecutive evil spirit without asking anything. However, Marnak explained the reason why he instantly destroyed these people. They could manipulate divinity and posed a very real threat to him. Very few were capable of that. Moreover, he was sure that his mother would prefer to see him alive than to win the argument. Farna still couldn't move, and watching the protagonist, she wondered in horror why he was talking to himself. Looking at the last of the remaining followers of the evil spirit, Marnak regained his more human appearance and looked at the girl with an absolutely calm and imperturbable gaze. But in this look she saw a real monster, whom she had never met before. She was so scared that her whole body trembled like an aspen leaf, and it seems that Marnak felt with his whole body the animal horror that the girl experienced while looking at him. This made him smile. Finally, he broke the silence and spoke to her. He asked her the same question that he asked the first follower of the evil spirit. Why did they surround Kelton? Fortunately, the girl decided not to be stupid and answer the protagonist's question. What he heard impressed him very much. It was difficult to even think about something like that. Of course, this plan turned out to be quite surprising, because they would not waste 3 years on some harmless prank. Parna turned out to be more talkative than her predecessor. She answered every question asked by the protagonist. She told him everything, as if she wasn't waiting for him to ask. The story here is simple. They wanted to sacrifice all the inhabitants of the city, and for this purpose, they created a ball that absorbed divinity, which they called incarnation. To carry out such a grandiose plan, they had been hiding in the city for 3 years, and in truth, the preparations should have taken at least another 5 days. But Carmen's escape was an unforeseen event, and they had to rush to the last stage of the plan because Carmen would sooner or later bring help. Great. The protagonist's bet played out successfully. The fourth follower told the whole plan. Now it's time to put an end to this bloody madness. Seeing the protagonist activate the sword, Parna asked with horror in her eyes what he was going to do. Very interesting. What did she herself think about this? Of course, the protagonist was going to kill the monster that had absorbed the flesh and blood of the inhabitants before he woke up. Parna desperately tried to stop Marnak, but it was too late. Having made an incision in the ball, which consisted of muscle fibers, the protagonist left a small hole, from which a bright light immediately began to shine. The girl said that if this thing senses danger, it will immediately wake up in an unstable form. But these words somewhat alarmed Marnak, and at the same moment, the consequences of his rash decision made themselves known. A white tentacle pierced the protagonist's shoulder with great speed, passing right through. The cocoon gradually began to collapse. The thin muscle tissue gradually tore, and a terrible monster was visible underneath. It desperately tried to get out of the cocoon, growling and in pain. Over time his eye appeared, full of despair, and conveying the unbearable pain that the creature was experiencing. After a few seconds, it tore the cocoon, exposing its torso. It was a creature with one single eye, and its skin was as snow-white as freshly fallen snow. Marnak understood perfectly well that the sacred relic was hidden in the monster, and he, together with the mother of corruption, will only destroy another seal. And then, he will present this piece of meat to his mother of corruption as a sacrifice. Parna watched in horror as Marnak cut off part of the limb of the freed monster and trampled on it like a carpet for wiping shoes. "You understand that this won't work?" Parna said, immediately letting out a long exhale as the protagonist cut her stomach with his chainsaw. Hundreds of small blades tore apart internal organs overnight, blood flowed, and pieces of bodies scattered around. Life slowly faded away in her eyes, her strength left her. "This is your punishment, Parna," said the protagonist, watching the girl slowly die. Having destroyed the last follower of the evil spirit from the entire company that started this bloody madness, he received 1,000 divinities. Now, taking into account the absorbed divinity, its quantity was 8,592. In addition to the followers of evil spirits, he also managed to extract divinity from the body of the deceased mayor. However, even with all the divinity gained, it was not enough. The new ability required about 10,000 divinity to obtain it. The thought flashed through the protagonist's head that he could get the missing divinity by simply chopping the monster with a ripper. But this monster was much stronger than ordinary creatures, so over time, he would simply recover. And on Marnak's shoulder, there was a wonderful reminder that this monster's attacks could not be missed. Otherwise, he would inevitably be defeated. The monster was just a large piece of meat. It did not have an obvious weak point, like the Spider Queen. Meanwhile, the monster had already completely freed himself from his shackles and was gradually getting out. In such an extreme situation, there was only one right decision. Run as quickly as possible, so as not to fall into the clutches of the awakened monster. There was misunderstanding in the monster's gaze. He expected the protagonist to attack him, but he only saw Marnak running away. The monster roared at the top of his lungs. Through the inhuman roar, he could be heard saying that he was in pain, so painful that it could not be described in words. Marnak continued to run away from his pursuer in a hurry, and along the way, he collected one divinity. It didn't take much at all to gain a new ability that could turn the tide of the battle. Running through the streets filled with the bodies of dead people, he collected one divinity from each. There was only one point in his plan, to run as fast as he could until he had collected enough divinity. It was a chase to the death. A follower of the mother of corruption, the main enemy of all living things, against the generation of evil spirits, from the most distant depths of hell. It all came down to just one thing. Either the monster will be able to grab Marnak first, tearing him apart, or Marnak will manage to gain a new ability in order to defeat the awakened monster.